Hello, I'm making this video as a response to one of the most persistent criticisms of Thomas Kay's animation, Edgar the Exploiter. A point of contention a lot of people raise is that Edgar would not fire Simon because Simon is indispensable to Edgar's business. This is something I like to call the indispensable janitor fallacy. The film points out the indisputable, self-evident fact that an employer will only employ a given individual so long as she considers it worthwhile to do so. By definition, if she doesn't consider it worthwhile, she won't do it. But what does worthwhile mean? Well, it simply means that the contribution that the employee makes to the business outweighs the cost of employing her. No employee is infinitely valuable. There's an upper limit to the cost at which any given employee is worthwhile to hire. If the cost of employing someone increases beyond that upper limit, perhaps due to minimum wage, then by definition it ceases to be worthwhile to employ that individual. Simon represents exactly such a person. The particular job he does and the particular wage he's paid are not important. He's just a cartoon character. He simply represents an employee whose employer considers worthwhile to hire at the pre-minimum wage cost and not worthwhile to hire at the post-minimum wage cost. If Simon were still worth hiring, then Edgar would not fire him, but would give him a raise. And that's exactly what happens with the character Bob. To argue that Simon should get a raise too is to argue that you know Edgar's business better than he does, which would be arrogant if this were a documentary, but is positively ludicrous given that this is a work of fiction devised as a thought experiment in which Simon's whole purpose is to represent someone whose employer considers not worth hiring at minimum wage. Now, if you still have your doubts, you're probably thinking to yourself, but Simon is infinitely valuable to Edgar's business. Without Simon, who's going to do the sweeping up? Well, maybe Edgar will pass this responsibility onto another employee who has more skills and experience and is thus still worth keeping on at minimum wage. Someone like Bob. It really doesn't matter. All we need to know is that if Edgar did consider it necessary to keep Simon on, then he would. But in this particular animated fictional thought experiment, Simon represents an employee whose employer does not consider worth keeping on. Hence, he loses his job. Remember, there are countless ways in which Edgar might rearrange his business model to get around having to employ someone like Simon. Ultimately, he could even liquidate his business and move into a different industry, or find a job, or retire. But by definition, he's only going to do what he considers worthwhile to do, and he does not consider it worthwhile to keep employing Simon. If you want a more detailed explanation as to why, you'll have to ask Thomas Kay if he'll pass on Edgar's number, and you can see if you can catch him when he's not in a meeting. Anyway, I hope that this has cleared up some stuff. That's the indispensable janitor fallacy. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.